Welcome to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about following Jesus in the tension of being in the world, but not of it. And today we are starting out on a new little mini-series in this election season here in America. We're going to be talking over the next few episodes about how we can engage in politics as followers of Jesus and how we cannot put our heads in the sand and just ignore it, but also not let it take us over and ruin our souls. And so I think it's going to be an encouragement to you. I'm excited for you to hear it. Let's jump in. Well, Steve Brooks, it is so good to be back in the studio with you.
Summer's over. We're back in the studio. Looking forward to it.
I'm too. We got a great season ahead. And as many people know, as everyone listening probably knows, the first part of our season is taking place in a moment for our country. It's election season here in the United States. We're a couple months away from selecting the next leader of our great nation. Everyone's pumped about it.
Heaven forbid, Wyatt. You know, I just got back from the most delightful getaway with my wife. We went here locally, Vashon Island, this beautiful, idyllic setting, all these farms, and they were just littered with political placards and signs. And I'm like, oh, here it comes.
Yeah. So, I mean, for some people listening to this, they're like, really, like, we're listening to politics in the news and our friends are talking about politics. Why does Native Exiles also have to be about politics? And the reason why we're going to spend a few episodes here, this mini series is going to take us all the way through the election, is for a couple of reasons. One, you really can't hide from this conversation. The political moment we're in is going to come to you, whether you want it or not, even if you don't read the news, even if you don't watch cable news. Your family, your friends are all consuming this stuff. There's going to be conversations that you're a part of. Even just the knowledge that this election is coming is giving, I think, most of us this base level low anxiety.
A little heartburn.
Yeah. So, like, it's here. You can't hide from it. And the reason why we're going to talk about it, especially from the perspective of pastors and trying to figure out how to navigate this as followers of Jesus, is we think that if you aren't intentional about how you engage in the political conversation, then there are some real dangers to your soul, to your community, to your relationship with the Lord. And so we're going to talk about those things. And this is a surprise to no one, but politics can bring out the worst in us. It can bring out the monster from within, and that happens all over the place.
Yeah, we had a recent experience not too distant past for you and for me that reminded us of this. You know, we were having our executive team meeting, sitting up in your nice office, all this light streaming in, and our Compassion Center director, Ari Mailer, walked up. Big muscle-bound Ari was literally shaking, and he said, "Guys, you got to come downstairs now."
Panic on his face. And I've never heard him speak with that urgency before. I need one of you right now. And we were like, what is happening? But actually, we were a little on edge already because on the third story of our building, which is where my office is, we heard some yelling from out in the parking lot. We didn't know where it was coming from or what was going on, but we had heard some disturbance. Then Ari comes up. We're kind of putting two and two together. So we send you, our champion.
Yeah, I'm 5'8", and you wimps sit there quietly while I go downstairs. And by that point, it's clear that we have a very unhappy human being at the front door of our office building. It was a woman. She was screaming uncontrollably, expletive-laden rant about how our church is politically crazy and we have betrayed Jesus. And it was quite a moment. I sat there and she pinned my ears back to my head for a good 10 minutes.
Not a member of our church.
Nope.
Someone who just wanted to find a church staff to yell at. And what were we being accused of there, Steve? Remember?
That we have given ourselves away to Trump, and we hate people of color. That's about all I heard in the 10 minutes of spit flying and, F words flying.
And as is so often the case in political debates, arguments, not a lot of truth behind those things. Like, it's not like I had just gotten done with my pro-Trump sermon series that she was commenting on or something like that.
You had not.
But that's just like, politics can make us crazy, and we're experiencing that in big ways and small. And so let's try to spell this out for folks. If you're not careful with politics, what might happen to you? And we're going to work through this in three things. It can be bad for your soul. It can be bad for your communities. It can be bad for your worship. And so let's start with the soul. Steve, how is politics potentially bad for your soul?
Yeah, it's easy to harangue this woman and act like she's just so ridiculous and the rest of us are all so well adjusted. But yeah, we all get kind of sucked, I think, if we're not careful, by the undertow, the undercurrent of the sway of politics and the sense that it controls everything. And if we don't, get in the right spot and know the right things and do the right things, we're going to be in trouble. I was reading recently in Isaiah, and he is talking to the people of Israel, and he says to them, don't call everything a conspiracy like they do, and don't live in dread of what frightens them. And that the conspiracy and the dread, those two words just are so poignant at this season.
It's also encouraging to know that this has been a problem for a long time. This is
700
BC. The book of Isaiah is describing, some similar things that we're going through right now. I think one of the things for people just to recognize about why this is the case, that politics can bring out the worst in us, is that there's something intentional happening in the political conversations right now, which is this massive emphasis on the negative, on negative emotion. Both sides of the political aisle and all mainstream media figured out in the social media age that the most motivating thing for people to engage more, to watch longer, to click on your links, to do all the things that make them money is anger, hate, fear, anxiety. It's all these negative emotions. They're the ones that produce response in us more often than any positive emotion, love, compassion, forgiveness, any of that. And so because of that, there's a strategy in place, which is just hammer people with the negative all the time. And it's really working. Pew Research did some studies in this last year of Americans, and they asked just a really simple question. When you think of American politics, what one word or phrase comes to mind? And it was completely open. It wasn't multiple choice. People could say whatever they wanted. And it was really fascinating. They said that of all the words and phrases people gave, 79% were negative. Something negative about politics is what came to mind first for people. And that's bad. But when you first hear that stat, you might think, it's not that bad. 20% positive isn't so bad. But no. It was not 20% positive. It was 79% negative, 10% neutral, not positive or negative. They just said some word or phrase like government or whatever. Then 9% refused to answer the question. And that leaves you with only 2% of responses that had anything positive to say. When you look at the word bubble of their responses, of the biggest, most common responses, they're things like divisive, chaos, corrupt, bad, polarized, messy, terrible, broken, dysfunctional, contentious, embarrassing, confusing, dumpster fire. Those are the things that people said the most often. And so just know, if politics makes you feel anxious, if it makes you feel fearful, angry, you're not alone.
Yeah.
It's actually not a problem with you. It's a problem with the water we're swimming in right now. And so your job, you can't change our culture. You can't change the national conversation. But as followers of Jesus, we do need to think about how are we going to thrive in this environment?
And we can ask ourselves how we aren't going to allow ourselves to let it bring out the worst in us. That passage I quoted earlier is so interesting. Those words, conspiracy and dread. In counseling, we sometimes talk about chronic anxiety versus acute anxiety. And acute anxiety is basic fear. It's aimed at something. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to, lose this bet or whatever. But chronic anxiety is just that nameless dread that seeps into your soul. And that seems to be what so much of our political discourse and process brings out in us, reflexive anger and panic and blame, not us at our best.
Yeah. So we're going to try to get to some solutions at the end, but let's just keep on with the bad news
There's
for
plenty
now.
of it.
So politics can be bad for your soul if you're not careful. It also can be bad for your communities. What do we mean by that, Steve?
Man, I just immediately am transported to a story, something that happened in my life about 8 years ago. It was 2 elections ago. And I remember I was talking with a good pastor friend of mine, and we were talking about what he felt was the end of the world. The apocalypse had arrived because his candidate had not been voted in. And where the conversation just got so dark, and I got such a window into how community can get so disrupted, is he had found out that some mutual good, Bible-believing, godly friends of ours had voted in a way that he was not particularly fond of.
So let's set the scene here. This is 2012.
2016.
No,
you're right. It was 2012.
This is 2012. This is the Obama-Romney election.
Yes, you're correct.
Yep. And that was the era where every good Bible-believing Christian was supposed to vote for a Mormon for some reason. But his friends had not done that. They had...
How dare they?
Gasp. Voted for Obama.
Voted for President Obama. And he did not simply question their intellect. He did not simply question their character. Wyatt, I'm not tongue in cheek now. It really was so disturbing to me. He questioned their faith. Like he said, I don't even know if these are real Christians. Yeah. These are people that I held in such high esteem, and frankly, he had too. And that one political choice was all he needed. It was the nail in their coffin.
And that really gets at the heart of why politics can be so dangerous for our communities. And I think there's a couple of things going on there. One is that politics takes very complicated, complex, nuanced things and forces them down to a simple binary. So politicians, their goal is to get elected. They get elected in, campaigns between typically one Democrat and one Republican. It's a binary choice. And so every issue, every topic has to get boiled down to this binary. And the binary is always going to be presented to you as my side is good and the other side is bad. It's clear. It's simple. There's no nuance. There's no middle ground. But in reality, nearly every political issue is complex and there is middle ground and there is nuance. But the conversation is going to constantly drive you to this binary worldview. And when you get that, it's this easy us versus them mentality.
And that's why we're drawn to it, right? It simplifies life for us in a way.
So there's a good team and a bad team, right, and everyone should be on the good team. And then in the church, in the Christian world, we adopt this idea that like every Christian obviously is going to be on the team that we think is the good team. And no Bible-believing Christian, no one who actually knows Jesus would be on the bad team. And so when you find someone who you love and think actually loves Jesus and you find out they're on the bad team, it can really throw you.
Blows your circuit.
And this is divided up small groups. This has caused people to leave churches. I mean, that's one of the sad things that happened coming out of COVID in my mind was as people had this disruption to their norm, they weren't going to church every week at the height of the pandemic, and then they re-entered the church world. For many people, it was a reset, and it was a chance to decide if they wanted to keep going to the church they were at or they didn't. And as people started going back to the church, what happened for so many is that they resorted based not on theological conviction or worship style or denomination or anything like that. They resorted based on politics. They found a church that politically was handling the issues around the pandemic the same way as their preferred side. And so we lost a lot of the beauty of Christian community. I mean, that's the whole point of church, is that we're a family brought together not by our common political opinions or anything else, our common ethnicity, our common stage of life or social economic status or anything like that. We're brought together by Jesus, and the diversity of everything else is what makes up some of the beauty of the church. And sadly, right now, politics is threatening that reality, where we're going to become, just groups who are the Republican-leaning church, the left-leaning church, this and that. And I think that's really a harmful thing for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gotten to the point where we almost have made an agreement with ourselves. We don't want to talk about COVID anymore, but it's not hyperbole for me to say that was maybe the hardest thing for me during COVID. It wasn't staying at home, wasn't feeling like I couldn't get my job done. It was losing some friends that I held really dear that I just would have never dreamed we would lose our friendship over political differences.
Yeah. So that's the second danger. Politics, if we're not careful, can be bad for our communities. The last is that it can be bad for our worship. What do you mean by that, Steve?
I think I just see that in terms of, we put things like national supremacy, security, my political perspective, basically before Jesus. Basically before believing Jesus is on the throne, Jesus is good, Jesus is seated at the right hand of God, and we start to doubt and we let it corrode our trust because we're losing these things that we perceive as almost more important than Jesus. Functionally, they become more important than Jesus.
Yeah, we're in a moment culturally right now where religion is declining. Church attendance on the whole in America is declining. The just cultural sense that people have, even if they weren't churched, or people who had a deep personal conviction that in general religion is a good and valuable thing, that is really declining. And in this environment where religion is declining in importance as a culture, I think what's taking its place is politics. Politics is becoming the new secular religion.
Yes, absolutely.
And we have to be aware of that when you're listening to news on cable TV, when you're, listening to the podcast of the person who's making money off of the political conversation, they're going to continue to lift up politics as the most important thing in our society. How many times have you heard someone say the phrase this year, this is the most important election of our lifetime? Like everything is about this moment right here. This is the most important thing. And the problem with that is if you don't bring your faith into that, if you don't come with your understanding that actually politics, while it may be important, is not nearly as important as my faith, as my church community, as the fact that God is in control, it's really going to mess with just your relationship with Him. You know, worship, so much of what worship is it is ascribing value. It is lifting up the name of something. That's what God invites us to do, to give Him the praise, the worth, the value that only He deserves. Politics is constantly going to try to suck you into giving that high level of value to other things, to political parties, to candidates, to any of that. And so often we just live as if who is president of the United States is actually way more important than it actually is. I'm not saying it's not important, but we think that who's president has this massive impact on our lives. And in reality, in general, in most election cycles, the day-to-day lives of Americans don't change all that much. I was laughing about this as I was engaging with somebody in our parking lot, and I don't know how politics came up. It just seems like it comes up without you even trying. And this guy was frustrated because he'd been getting some spam calls, and I didn't know anything about his political persuasion, but he just told me, yeah, like I'm just so thankful that when Trump is back in office, we'll stop getting these scam calls. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, are you getting spam calls from Biden? Oh, no. I just mean like Trump's going to put an end to this. And I'm like, I don't think Trump is going to do anything about spam calls. I don't think Biden's pro spam call. But it's just, it was this belief that when Trump gets back into office, essentially all will be made right with the world again. And politics just does not have that power. And if you aren't careful, it will get you to worship the wrong things.
Yeah, I mean, like you said a minute ago, I think if you asked most Christians what they think and who's in control and what's more important, Jesus on the throne or who's in political office, we would all say the right answer. But it's hard. You know, it's hard when the facts of life and the frustrations of the world and the brokenness are right in front of you. I was sharing with you recently about a sermon that somebody sent me. They texted it to me and they said, the best political sermon you'll ever hear. And the little YouTube teaser has this preacher saying with this full compassion, government will not save you. And I'm like, hurrah, amen. And the next line is, so get out there and demand that your vote be heard and change the world. And it's just this contradiction that we have. You know, we would say that Jesus is on the throne, but we live like politics is more important.
That's so good. All right. Well, enough bad news. It's time to get to some solutions.
About time.
I'm excited in this next section to start talking with you a little bit about, okay, what do we do as followers of Jesus? How do we navigate this? How do we protect ourselves from these dangers? So let's take a break and we'll get back to that. Steve, we were just chatting a little bit during the break, and you reminded me, speaking of how politics would be bad for our worship, there was such just a jaw-dropping story that we encountered, not this election cycle, but the previous one.
Yes.
Remind me about that.
It was a troubling moment. We were representing a ministry that we partner with here called the Good Neighbor Team, and it's part of the ministry of World Relief, where a church welcomes, assists immigrants who are coming into the country. Refugees, immigrants, asylees. It's a beautiful thing, helping them get jobs, get on their feet, etc. And one of our folks really connected with that program was out in the hallway representing it. So many people were encouraged. This is beautiful. This is great.
Well, I do want to just set the tone because this was during one of Trump's presidential
2016
run-up. It's not
right?
even 2016,
yep.
Where immigration was a huge issue. This is peak, like, build a wall. This is peak Trump making some derogatory comments about certain whole countries. And it was big in the political conversation. But we weren't thinking about that. We were just being a church, loving refugees.
Like Jesus called us to. And honestly, I mean, I know this church really, really well. People were coming to my friend Mark, standing there in the lobby from both political persuasions and saying, this is awesome, this is great, as followers of Jesus, until this one couple literally accosted him, asked how he could represent something like this and truly love Jesus, and just made a horrible scene, to which I had to obviously make a follow-up phone call. And there was this line, Wyatt, that I will never forget the rest of my days. I'm chatting with the wife, and she says to me, castigating, chiding me, do you actually mean that you're going to put the gospel before the security of our country? And I have never had to pick my job off the floor any more than I did at that moment. And that just kind of sums it up for me.
And I mean, just it's so perfect because obviously your answer to that question is yes. Yes, we are going to put the gospel before the security of our country or any political conversation of any kind. And that I think that sums up what happens so easily, which is we get our priorities.
I don't think she knew
backwards.
what she said, honestly.
Oh yeah.
I don't think she knew what was coming out of her mouth.
But that happens. So like very few of us, I think, would say something like that. But it's so easy for that to happen where our priorities just get backwards. Rather than looking at politics through the lens of our faith, we look at our faith and our church through the lens of politics. And so it's not to say that political conversations aren't important or they don't matter, but it is to say, let's make sure we get it in the right order. And so let's talk about that a little bit here of like, how can we still engage in politics, but look at it through the right lens, in the right order of importance? And the place I want to start is just to recognize Jesus talks a lot about how we treat our enemy. And there's very few places in society today where we like have clear enemies, but politics is one of them. Each side is trying very hard to convince you that the other side is the enemy. And I think that binary is dangerous. I don't think we should accept that sort of dichotomy. But let's just assume that you do. Assume that you really do think there is an enemy out there politically. They're advocating for policies that are going to harm the nation. They're advocating for policies that are going to take your freedoms away, your rights away, whatever it is. They're the enemy. Before you go any further, why don't we stop and just ask, okay, what does Jesus ask of us when we engage with our enemies? And, he asks us actually to love our enemies, not to hate them, not to castigate them, not to destroy them, to love them. And politics is one of the best arenas for us to put that teaching of Jesus into practice, in my mind.
And just in concrete terms, 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, and one of the things that Paul specifically calls out that is a part of our Christian love is love always believes the best.
Yeah.
Or in some translations, love always trusts. And that clearly is not what we're often doing with those that we view as our enemies politically.
Oh, I mean, just what a check could that be for us? If like every time you're engaging with somebody who disagrees with you, maybe it's at the Thanksgiving table this upcoming November, maybe it's just every time you're engaging in news and just what people are writing about different political people or movements or whatever. Like, what have you checked yourself on that? Am I believing the best about this person I disagree with? Am I giving them the benefit of the doubt? Am I trying to figure out the best way to articulate their position, even though I disagree with it? Or am I doing what basically everybody is doing right now, which is straw manning the other side's arguments, only pointing out the worst examples of someone's position?
My goodness, wait a minute. Isn't it interesting how in politics, just like in other areas of life, but in politics, you see it so boldly, like when someone on the other side has some egregious fault, does something horrible, morally reprehensible, we say, that's totally representative of that party. But if somebody does something on, quote, my side, and when we get called out, we say, well, don't judge me, or you're picking the worst of, me. It's it's weird how blind we are as human beings.
Yeah, so good. I mean, it reminds me right now of the conversation that's going on. Sadly, there's been 2 recent attempts on President Trump's life.
Right.
That has started a conversation in the political realm about just the temperature of our conversation right now, of how heated things have been, the rhetoric being used, and the need in our country to really bring that down, to start speaking with more respect towards one another, which I think is a very
be a welcome change
to advocate for. But what's so funny to me about it is both sides right now are only talking about how the other side has to be the one to bring the temperature of the conversation down. And it's just like, okay, can we please, can we think about how we can describe each other in the best possible terms? Not that we're going to agree on everything. We're going to disagree on a lot. And it's important to talk about that. But rather than only focus on the negatives of the other side, can we focus on the good as well? I love Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, and I think it applies so strongly to this conversation because, the Samaritan was maybe the closest comparable thing to our world of the way we have this binary, we simplify people's identity
Good
under
guys,
one
bad
thing,
guys.
right? Like for the Jews, if you just use that one word to describe someone, a Samaritan, you told them everything they needed to know about that person. Their faith was, not in line with what they believed. They were a heretical movement according to the Jews. They thought that they were, morally corrupt. They were an enemy politically. They all sorts of things. And when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, what he's doing is he's forcing them to complicate their view of human beings. I mean, just the title of that parable, the Good Samaritan, was an oxymoron to Jewish people. There was no such thing as a Good Samaritan, but that's what Jesus is inviting us into, is can you see somebody for more than just the binary title that their position tells you about them? And I think it's a good challenge for us as well. Go ahead.
Another thing that comes to mind right now, Wyatt, and I couldn't agree more with what you just said. I mean, that is the definition of believing the best in someone. But I'm dreading something as we enter into these last couple of months, and it goes back to what I went through 4 years ago in the election, where I might say to somebody that I think they're getting a little too political, or if they disagree with me too vehemently, I say, I don't think this matters quite as much as you think. And there's just these questions that are like those shutdown questions, like, should we just hand everything over to them? Or questions like, are we just going to stick our head in the sand? I mean, how do you deal with those questions? They're really, because they've come to me from people very close to me,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest pushback I get as well, as I'm trying to tell people, like, politics doesn't affect as much as you think it does. You probably should think about how much time you're giving to reading news.
That really makes people mad when you say that.
What really makes people mad is when I remind people, this election will not be impacted one way or the other based on your vote. Like what you check on that ballot is not going to change anything about the outcome of this election. And so I'm not saying that to say don't vote, and I'm not saying that to say voting doesn't matter. The fact that we all can vote is a hugely important thing. I love America. I have to say that a lot these days. But let's not, sometimes we think like our ballot is so incredibly important, and it really isn't as important as maybe we think it is. And so the reason I say that is if you engaging in this political process, if you casting a vote for a candidate, if it is turning you into a person that you don't want to be, if it's causing problems in your marriage, with your relationship with your kids, with your church, like maybe it's not worth it. Maybe you should take a couple steps back and just take a breather for a moment on this conversation. But then you get that response from people. You're just telling us to put our heads in the sand. You're just going to let them run the country. Like if we don't all vote, then we're
going to get run over.
Horrible things are going to happen. And this is where I want to invite people to just consider the question: where has God given you the most influence?
You preached on this a while ago. You talked about, I think you called it the ladder of influence. Talk about that some more, because that was really helpful for me.
Yeah, and we'll throw a link to a graphic of this in the show notes so that if people want to take a look at the visual representation of it, they can. But the ladder of influence is just something where we first start by recognizing who we think has the most influence over society. So at the top of the ladder, the people with the most influence on society, is our national politicians. It's the presidential election race. That's why almost all the political conversation is about who's going to be president of the United States, not who's going to be the representative from the 117th district of whatever, because we think the president has the most influence. It's the most important thing. It's at the top of the ladder. And if you think coming down the ladder slightly, the people who still have a lot of influence on society, people like our state politicians, our local politicians, you get down below that of the things that influence society. Maybe you think of things like community groups. These aren't a huge thing anymore, but the Rotary Club, your softball team, your church is a part of this. That churches have more influence on society than individuals too. Keep coming down the ladder of influence, less and less influence on society, your neighborhood, your family, your friends, and then finally at the bottom of the ladder is you. You just, the individual that you are, you have really not that much influence on society. That's how we think about the ladder. And so, because the things at the top of the ladder matter so much, at least that's what we think, that's where we put our attention. That's what we spend our time talking about, researching, listening to news shows, arguing with people, all that kind of stuff. But what I want to invite people to do is to flip the ladder upside down, not by asking who has the most influence on society, but by asking the question, where has God given you the most influence? And if you ask that question, the latter is completely reversed. God has given you the most influence over you. That is the most influence you have, is over your own life, your own choices, your own direction. Slightly up from that, he's given you a ton of influence over your family, your friendships. More than that, he's given you some influence in your community groups, in your church, in your neighborhoods, all of that. As you keep going back up the ladder, you have to recognize he's given you next to no influence over national politicians, state politicians, representatives, those sorts of things. In America, he's given us a little bit of influence. We get to vote. We cast one vote, but that is still such a small amount of influence we get to wield. And so my plea to Christians is invest your time, your energy, your emotional bandwidth, all of that, not in the areas that you think have the most influence on society, but on the areas where God has given you the most influence. And then lastly, never trade in your influence on the people closest to you for a position on national politics, which happens all the time. People ruin the relationships that God has given them with their spouse, with their kids, with their neighbor, over their position on some national thing that's never going to matter, but it has this tremendously negative effect on the real relationships in their life, and that's just never worth it.
Yeah, I mean, you could even say what we're doing isn't just giving our energy and our time, we're giving our love and our worship, kind of going back to where we started. I don't think a lot of people think of politics necessarily something they worship, but it is often an idol, because it's the thing that you think will bring you security and influence and lasting power. And yeah, I think that's a really good word. You said two things that I think are super helpful for us. One is kind of just taking a look at the effect your attention and perhaps devotion to politics is having on those around you. And maybe the best people to gauge that are those around you. So
if there's any left,
if you have any bridges you haven't burned. So actually, I think especially for parents and spouses, it's good for us to go to the people we live with and say, hey, I read a lot of news or I talk about this. How do you think it affects me, and how does that affect you? I think that would be helpful. And you also just said, recognize that if you want to make lasting change in the world, the people right next to you are the people where you're going to be able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot in this election cycle. I'm really engaged in politics. I need to take some of my own advice in this. I read a lot of news. I stay up on all the issues. I watch the debates. I am going to vote. I'm not against voting at all. And I inherited that a lot from my dad. My dad is very much into politics. And, when I was growing up, driving around with my dad in the car, it was always 570 KVI on the radio,
Limbaugh?
which was Rush Limbaugh and, all of that, and Sean Hannity. And as I've grown, my political perspective has become a little bit more complex, and I see things from different sides, and I don't fit neatly into any one category. And my dad is my dad. He's still that conservative perspective, and that's completely fine. And so we have conversations about politics often, and very often we're coming from different angles. And this is one that's just it rings so true with me of like, I need to be so careful never to jeopardize my relationship with my dad over some dumb political argument. And I love to argue, and most of the time my dad and I can have these arguments in good spirits and in good faith, and we're very close and will be forever. But it is so tempting to cross the line. It's so tempting to let politics get in the way of something that is so much more important than my opinion on some policy or person or whatever. And so that's the one that I maybe need to hear the most often than anything.
So we've listed a couple things I think really helpful here. One is just loving our enemies, what it means to follow Jesus, believing the best about each other. 2, recognizing the ladder of influence. I think a good way to maybe kind of close out the conversation as we're trying to think of solutions and healthy ways to approach this is just kind of reminding ourselves of an eternal perspective. If there's anything Jesus calls us to, it's that. And, Jesus' final words as he was leaving the disciples were, all authority has been given to me. We know from the New Testament, Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father. He has all authority. And yet I was thinking about, what Hebrews says. The book of Hebrews says that everything is subject to him, but as it is right now, we don't see everything subjected to him. And that's where the frustration comes in. Like, why doesn't he just, if he is king and he is Lord, why doesn't he just come and make everything right now?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important question for us to ask ourselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think God's answer to that of why he hasn't made anything right now is because he's patient.
Yes.
And he longs for more people to come to faith. He longs for everyone to repent, and he's patiently delaying the end of all things so that more people can come to Christ. I think for me, it's important to remember that because it reminds us of what our job actually is. Our job is not to convince people to vote a certain way. Our job is to preach the gospel and invite people to follow Jesus because that's where salvation is found. I think what's also important for me to remember in that eternal perspective is you got to remember who's actually in control. I mean, the pull of politics is to make everything about this moment. I can't tell you how many times I've heard in ads and political campaigns and all of that, this is the most important election of our lifetime. How many times have you heard that in this season? Like everything is about this moment right here is what matters more than anything. And as Christians, we just can't believe that.
Which is the antithesis of the eternal perspective, right?
Correct. That one, the story goes on a lot longer than just this moment. Also, we know how it's written. We know how it ends, that God is going to be faithful to make all things new, and that does not hinge on this election. And so just remembering who God is a huge part of this. I love Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, talking of God. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. Remembering God is the one who sits on a throne. He is the one who lifts up kings and takes them down, who establishes nations, who dissolves them. We get a small part in that in some small, tiny way that we live in a democracy and we get to vote, but that doesn't mean it's ours to control. It's still God's to control. So I think more than anything, that's what we need to remember together.
Yeah, he has the power and he has it all right now. It's not like he's up there like working on his rhetorical skills so he can give better speeches or mustering more campaign dollars. Yeah. He is king right now. He has all the power. But I love what you just said. He's waiting because he's merciful.
Yeah.
And our job is to be part of spreading that good news. That's a campaign worth getting behind. And so, yeah, we really need to work on that eternal perspective.
Yeah. We need to remember that God is not nervous at all about this election coming up. Not at all. And we serve him and we can trust him. And so let's follow suit in that as well. Steve, thanks for the conversation today.
It's good stuff. Thanks for being with us again on Native Exiles. We're entering some tricky waters. This is a tough season, the political season, heading into the election. I hope this has been really encouraging for you, really practical for you. Wyatt and I are going to have more conversations about this topic in the coming weeks. We look forward to being with you for those. Please share this with your friends, your neighbors. Please subscribe, follow along, tell somebody about the podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time on Native Exiles.